Last week, we started a new series called 7 Letters to 7 Churches, and we're studying these letters written or dictated by Jesus to the disciple John while he was on Patmos and given to 7 local churches in Asia Minor. We started last week with Ephesus. This week, we moved just 30 miles north. I'm going to show you a map now. We're going to move 30 miles north from Ephesus, which is the lower green dot on the coast, Ephesus, 30 miles north to Smyrna, right? So Smyrna, this is not Smyrna, Tennessee or Smyrna, Texas. This is Smyrna in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. And there are a couple things, well, actually many things that I feel like that you need to understand about Smyrna in order to understand the letter that we need to read and study today. Let me back up just one step and say this. There is a chance that what you were recruited to when you were called and invited to come to church for the first time, whether you were 8 or 18 or 25, if it was in America, if it was in the South, there is a chance that what you were recruited to and what Jesus calls true discipleship are 2 different things. And we need to think about that this morning. This is a heavy subject this morning. No way around it. It is just a heavy subject. In fact, it deals with persecution and martyrdom. So when you think about persecution in 2016, understand this, that Open Doors Ministry, which tracks persecutions globally, Open Doors Ministry says in 2016, 100 million Christians are being persecuted. 100 million Christians. In 2015, 7,000 Christians were killed for their faith in Jesus Christ. In 2014, it's just up 3,000. In 2014, it was 4,000 were killed for their faith in Christ. And that's that we know about. So you see, when I started coming to church, in fact, when I started sort of leaning into what is it like to follow Jesus, what I was being recruited to was pizza and fun. We're talking about persecution and martyrdom today. It's just 2 very different worlds, and it means some things for us. Now, to understand Smyrna, you need some relevant information. So Smyrna, at the end of the first century, was a competitor city to Ephesus. It had its own harbor. I mean, it is a beautiful, beautiful city. It had its own harbor, and that harbor brought economy, just like Ephesus harbor brought economy. There were 100,000 people in this city in the first century, which is at the end of the first century when they received this letter. It's defensible. It's connected to all the trade routes, and they are exporters. So they're exporting things like cotton, licorice. Anybody like licorice? Licorice root, they're all about licorice root. Opium, anybody like opium? No, don't raise your hand. They're exporting opium, they're exporting cotton, sponges, all kinds of things coming out of Smyrna. But today, Smyrna has become a very modern city called Izmir. If you'll give me the second or third slide. This is modern-day Izmir looking from a mountain called Mount Pagus. Can you say Pagus? Pagus, all right? It's not that hard. This is a view from Mount Pagus. Mount Pagus is the Acropolis, or the highest point in ancient Smyrna. It's also the highest point right here around this particular area in Izmir. You can see that it is a business center, that it is well populated, that it's full of residential areas. And so because of that, ancient Smyrna hasn't been excavated to the degree that other areas have because it's modern. So give me that next slide. So what you're going to see if you go to ancient Smyrna is basically this, right? So I can tell you the restrooms are right back there. A good tour guide always knows where the restrooms are for his group. Right back there. Up on the flag on top of the hill, that's Mount Pagus, where we looked at our first sort of glimpse at modern-day Izmir, looking down. And then you have ruins, some that are here, but there is an agora or shops, businesses that you could walk through underground. There is a fountain down there. That's about it. You could walk around the whole thing in about 20 minutes. But we do know some things. Even though there's limited archaeology, we do know a few things. And an artist, his name is Balaj Below, he makes his living taking archaeology and illustrating what the city would have been like in first century biblical times. And so give me that next slide. So what you're looking at is Smyrna. Now, same view from Mount Pagus. The artist obviously stood at Mount Pagus, envisioned this, and drew it. Now, what you're going to see is a master planned community. These are very straight streets. You're going to have grid, but also what you see. Do you see wealth in this city? I mean, everything is made of marble. All the orange roof is just to accentuate the power and the might of Rome. So when you're talking about Smyrna in the first century, you're talking about Rome, just like Ephesus. I don't know what you think when you think Turkey, but in the first century, Turkey was Roman. Right? And so this is Rome. You see the harbor that we talked about just a little bit. This harbor, export, import, economy, influence. Not only harbor, but you see a massive theater. Do you see that theater? That theater seats 20,000 people. So if you want to go to the theater in Smyrna, you go to this theater. You can sit with 20,000 of your closest friends and watch the great plays of the day. There is a building in Smyrna called the Homerium. All right, the Homerium is a building dedicated to Homer, the epic poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. How many of you have ever read Iliad and the Odyssey? All right, so in this city, they're worshiping the gods that Homer writes about in the Iliad and the Odyssey. He's born in about 850 BC, 850 years before Jesus. So he is informing all of that time period, 850 years before Jesus, till now, when everybody that goes to school has to read what? The Iliad and the Odyssey. So this is an influential city when you begin to think art and poetry, right? Outside of this city is stadium. All right, so you have a massive stadium here at Smyrna. When you think stadium, think Olympic Games. The Greeks bring the Olympics. Smyrna is known for the games. When you win in the Olympic Games, you receive a victor's crown. It's not a kingly crown made of a precious metal. It's a crown of vines and flowers that is set on your head. The crown in and of itself is not valuable, but what it symbolizes is victory, right? So you have stadium. Also think later, gladiators. Anybody ever seen the movie Gladiator? You're allowed to say yes. It's okay. This is happening in Smyrna. Slave trade and gladiators and all of it, okay? So also the persecution of Christians goes down in the stadium. So when you begin to think Smyrna, you're thinking all these things. Gymnasium, education, there's a school of science and medicine. They also worship gods and goddesses. So last week we talked about Ephesus being focused on Artemis. In Smyrna, they're not focused on any one particular cult necessarily, but they have a temple to Zeus, a temple to a goddess named Sybil. They have found in the wreckage statues of Hermes, Dionysus, Eros, Heracles, so many gods and goddesses. So what's happening there is they're just worshiping them all. If it is a Roman god or goddess, Sybil actually comes out of Asia Minor. She's this mother goddess. Zeus is the king of kings, so to speak. And you're looking at a temple now from Smyrna. This is the Zeus temple, and in front of it is a statue of Sybil, right? Now, there's a street that connects Sibyl's temple and Zeus's temple, and it's called the Golden Street. It was the most beautiful of all the streets in Smyrna. So when they begin to hear about streets of gold in heaven from the Christians, they're like, we already got our Golden Street. Why would we wait for that? So a big question here is, why did Asia Minor change? Why did Rome and all its glory suddenly begin changing and become gospel-focused just decades and even centuries later? Turkey is mostly Christian. So what changed here? Because really, poor Christians didn't have anything to offer these people. They already had their streets of gold. They already had their gods and goddesses. They already had their economy and influence and wealth and shops. In fact, here in Smyrna, they also worship Caesar. Right? In Ephesus, I talked to you a little bit about Caesar Augustus. He's the emperor of Rome when Jesus is born and for the first part of Jesus' life. But later, Tiberius Caesar, about halfway through Jesus' life on the planet, Tiberius becomes Caesar. And in Smyrna, Smyrna becomes Neocorus or Neocorit for Tiberius. Now, what does that mean, Neocorus? It's simply they are the temple warden for Tiberius, which means while Tiberius is emperor, no taxation for this city. You want to live in a city with no taxes? Who doesn't? Come on. Everybody wants to live there. And so it brings more money because there's no taxes. And it also brings travelers and tourists who want to worship the emperor, the reigning emperor of Rome, Tiberius. In their minds, Tiberius now is the Son of God walking the planet. That's how the Romans view him. So this is the context that we insert ourselves into today. Interestingly, in that community, there was a strong Jewish community. But this Jewish community in the annals of history is noted as being bitterly hostile toward the Christians. I mean, bitterly hostile. They are described as given way to temptation, meaning that they're in Smyrna, they're Jewish, they have a synagogue, but they are embracing all that is Rome. Because why? It's comfortable. There's more money in it. There's no persecution if you embrace Rome. And so they are known as embracing Rome and bitter toward the church. They are not the Jews of the Torah that we read about for lots of reasons. That church there is described by history as honorable. In fact, one writer says it was kept pure by continual suffering. It was poor, it was impoverished, and it was oppressed, and it was persecuted, but it was not exposed to what the writer says, the dangers of riches. In other words, God had their hearts. And they were not exposed to the dangers of Rome and riches because they didn't sell out to it. The contrast between the Jewish synagogue and the church of Jesus Christ. That brings us to our letter. So if you would you stand and we will read Revelation chapter 2. With everything that you know now, let's read this letter. Beginning of verse 8. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. You may be seated. As always with these letters, it's very interesting to note how Jesus describes himself as the author. And here in verse 8 it says, "And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write," and here's his introduction, "the words of the first and the last who died and came to life." So what Jesus is saying as he presents this letter that will be read, imagine this. You gather in a completely Roman city in a house. It's packed. You're sitting on the floor. Some of you are standing around the edges of the room. All of us can't get in, so we're around the windows and the door listening in as this letter is delivered and someone is standing up to read it. And you hear the introduction. These are the words of the one who is the first and the last. They know who that is because they've already learned that Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. There is none like him. He's the only one. Jesus also clarifies to say, lest you get confused about this Tiberius who says he's the Son of God, I'm the one who died and came to life. That clarifies who we're talking about here. And this is important to them. It's going to be important to them as they move through this letter that Jesus was victorious. He died, but he came to life. He is the victor. I mean, they live in a town that is all about victory. There's crown imagery everywhere. That Mount Pagus, the buildings on top of it, they call it the crown of Smyrna. Their coins, I had a coin slide and I forgot to show you if you guys will go back there and just look at it. Their coins, this is Sybil. On her head is the crown. That is the crown of Smyrna. And on the other side is the victor's crown from the games, indicating that this is from Smyrna. This is a town all about victory. And Jesus is saying at the beginning, I'm the victor. I'm the first and the last. I'm the one who died and came to life. Now he has their attention. This is the most important letter they could ever receive. And remember, this is apocalyptic literature. So John's praying in the island of Patmos. He has a vision from Jesus. Jesus tells him what to write. He writes it. John is influential all over Turkey. He disciples people. He starts churches all over Turkey. As Paul is influential, so is the disciple John. And it's important to get your mind around that from the get-go. So here's what Jesus says. Verse 9, we're going to break it down like we break down all the letters. What does Jesus affirm about the church? What does he sort of condemn about the church or say that needs to be changed? What commands or imperatives does he give the church? And what promises does he give the church? So let's start with what he affirms. Verse 9, I know your tribulation and your poverty. So he's the one, he knows them. He knows everything they're going through. That word tribulation is persecution for their faith, right? They are facing persecution and poverty because they will not worship the gods and they will not worship Caesar. They're staying pure. Plus, this Jewish synagogue is persecuting them. Jesus is saying, I know all this about you, but you are rich. Now, if you looked at them, you would not say they were rich. You would say the ones that worship Zeus are rich. The ones that worship Sybil are rich. The ones that worship Tiberius are rich. But if you looked at these, you would not say they are rich. They're poverty-stricken, persecuted. There was a time on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus gave the most famous sermon that you've read of his. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. John was there, the disciple who would affect all of Asia Minor with the gospel. John was there. And Jesus said this to his boys on the side of the Sea of Galilee in Matthew chapter 6, 19. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. John heard that. John that affects Smyrna. John who, by Jesus' leading, writes Smyrna. And the people of Smyrna, the church of Smyrna, they believe that so much that we're not going to worship the emperor. We're going to store up for ourselves treasures in heaven. And Jesus is saying to them, look, I know you're poverty-stricken. I know you're facing tribulation, but good job because you are rich. See, Jesus can see things they can't see. Their treasure that's being stored up in heaven. I mean, for Smyrna and all its inhabitants, that illustration you saw is the best it ever gets. It's as good as it gets. And you saw what's left of it already, right? Not much. Not much. But they were storing up treasures in heaven. Now, he goes on to say, if you follow the text, you are rich, and the slander you're facing, in other words, the Jews are talking bad about you, that slander of those who say they're Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Now, Jesus often uses very harsh terms. Do you think synagogue of Satan is politically correct? No. Now, what does he mean by that? So, what he's saying is, look, these Jews who say they are Jews are not Jews. Their heritage is Jewish, but they're not true Jews. They're not your root, because if they were, they would Shema. Deuteronomy 6, I mean, this is the Pledge of Allegiance. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. If you do that, you're not worshiping Caesar, you're not worshiping Sybil, you're not worshiping Zeus, you're not doing whatever it takes to be comfortable in this city. But instead, you love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Leviticus 19:18, and love your neighbor as yourself. For the Jew, in the Torah, the Jew is told, leave the corners of your fields for people that are just walking by, always so they can eat. Always be thinking about other people. So the Jews are, Jesus said it later, love God and love people. These are the two greatest commands, but they are driven by Shema. Love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength. And then Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. These Jews were not. They're persecuting their neighbors. They're not loving God. And Jesus calls them the synagogue of Satan. So before you're too hard on them, though, and I would say that the purity of the church reminded them of who they were supposed to be. And on top of everything else, that sort of ticked them off, right? It's like looking in the mirror and seeing what you should be, but you're not. And so, but before you're too hard on them, we have churches in our country that I think Jesus would call churches of Satan. One in particular I think about, I usually don't call names, but this is so obvious that it's like, who cares? They'll probably be out here next week. Westboro Baptist Church. This church that pickets everybody, that says God hates you and God hates you and God hates you. You know what their core value is? Hate. And so everybody knows them for hate. They even got a Wikipedia page. It's got a picture of the church, all the things that they did, all the things that they've picketed, and they're telling everybody, God hates you. This is a church of Satan, right? So it's easy. It's not hard to make the leap when you think about that, right? These Jews have entered the culture, and for whatever reason, they have become the synagogue of Satan in this particular letter. So, think about it this way. Paul says it, Romans 2:28-29, for no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly. And circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God, right? So, when Jesus looks at the heart of these Jews, he sees everything but what he wants to see, right? Now, what does Jesus, so he affirms the church, you're going to make it, you're rich, I know everything that's going on to you. What does he condemn like he condemned at Ephesus? What does he condemn? The answer is nothing. This church gets nothing to change, which is huge. Sometimes you need to look at what Jesus doesn't say. If all the other ones get correction and conviction and condemnation and rebuke, and this one doesn't, you have to ask yourself, why doesn't it? You know why? Because in the midst of Smyrna, with gods and goddesses and emperor worship, and the way to eat is to worship, they have not caved. They have been faithful. No condemnation. They're the poorest. That flies in the face of the health and wealth gospel. Read the text. They were poor. Anybody who says if you're going to walk with God the right way, you have to be rich is a liar. Read the text. Now, this, for the health and wealth thing, this is killer. I don't even know how they explain it, because Jesus goes on to say that you're going to go through some things. He doesn't condemn anything, but he says, beware, be warned. Check out verse 10. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. What you are about to suffer. You're getting ready to go through this. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. So what are the commands here? They're getting ready to go through something terrible. How would you like to be the recipient of that letter? They're already struggling to eat and have clothes. You have joy in community. You're supporting each other. You've got your eyes fixed on Jesus. But now Jesus is telling you you're getting ready to go through an intense period of suffering. And they already thought they were. You ever been to this place in your life where you're like, how could it get any worse than it did? This is what's happening to them. Okay, and so he gives them some commands here. Here's what he says. Here are the imperatives. Number one, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Do not fear. Now, this is where we have a hard time getting our mind around this thing as Americans. Because 99.9% of the people in America that are hearing my words have not suffered for their faith. I'm not saying everybody, some people have, but have not suffered for the faith. So we don't have a grid for this. We have to sort of insert ourselves here and see how it could possibly be. And he's saying, in the midst of this suffering that is coming, do not fear. Well, of course, wouldn't you be afraid? Jesus is telling you you're getting ready to be thrown into suffering by the devil himself. Wouldn't you be afraid? He says, do not fear. In fact, right before he sent out the disciples, actually a group of 72, to begin to go out in the Middle East for the first time to take the gospel message. He's still living. He hasn't been crucified yet. Matthew 10:28, as he gets ready to send them out, he says, and don't fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Again, Jesus is not being politically correct with these guys at all. Hey, don't fear people. Fear the one who can throw your body and your soul in hell. All right? Then Matthew 10:22, this is the second imperative we get in this letter, is this: be faithful unto death. So do not fear and be faithful unto death. So he is asking these people sitting in this house, kneeling around, hanging in windows, up against the wall. He's asking them to not fear suffering and be faithful unto death. Not asking, commanding is the language. Be faithful unto death. Are you freaking out at this point if you're in that house? Yes, you are. Matthew 10:22, just as he's sending the disciples and others out for the first time, he tells them, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Do not fear. It's coming. Do not fear and be faithful unto death. Really? Why? Would any of you be sitting in that house in that moment going, why would I be faithful unto death? Wouldn't it be okay to just say Lord Caesar once so that I don't have to face this? So that my family is safe, so that my kids aren't persecuted? Wouldn't it be okay? And no, Jesus is saying, be faithful unto death. No fear. Why? Because of the way he introduced himself. I'm the first and the last. I am the one who died and came to life. I am victorious. Even if you die, I'm victorious. I'm the one who died and came to life. It's why he introduces himself this way, and he makes some promises to them. Number one, if you are faithful unto death, I will give you the what? The crown of life. The crown of life. Everybody in Smyrna is chasing a crown. They're looking up at it every day. Mount Pagus. It's the crown of Smyrna. They're seeing them distributed to the best athletes in all the land at the games every weekend. It's the victor's crown. And yet Jesus is saying, if you will endure to the end, I will give you the crown of life. Again, the word is not this metal sort of kingly crown that's worth something in and of itself. It's that victor's crown at the end of the race that's made of what you get from the earth, vines and flowers, and it's placed on the head. And the crown of life is symbolic for the experience you've endured. It's not that that crown is worth something. It's that you endured. It's just like the victor at the end of a race. You won the race. You endured. Both Paul and now here Jesus always use stadium imagery because they're talking to people who understand stadium. Paul says at one time, I want to fight the good fight of faith. He says, I want to run the race in such a way as to receive the prize. He says in Hebrews, we're told they're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. It's stadium imagery, all of it. Jesus is saying, look, you endure this. You run this race, and I will give you the crown of life. Not the crown of Smyrna, not your coins with crowns on it, with Sybil, but the crown of life. Second thing he says, I think is clear, it's very clear, is that you will not, this is the second promise, you will not be hurt at all by the second death. All right. Into verse 10. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. What is the second death? Right? So Revelation chapter 20, 14 and 15, the question is answered. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. So if you track sort of the timeline in the book of Revelation, the chronology as best I understand it, what comes is all of us will die. The first death. My body will die. Your body will die. And there is a judgment at that time. And for us now, we go to a very present heaven. But there is a second judgment coming called the Great White Throne Judgment, according to the book of Revelation. In that judgment, a book is opened. Everybody is lined up and judged according to their deeds. Now that initially begins to mess with Christians who don't know the text very much. I thought you said we're judged based on Christ's work, and it is true. But the book is open, and everybody is lined up. For the Christian, your name, the scripture says this, if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. For the Christian, because of the work of Christ on the cross, because he's the first and the last, he's the one that died and came to life, when you confess him for the forgiveness of sins as Savior and Lord, your name is written in the book of life. So he took yours to make it simple. But for the non-believer, his or her name is not written in the book of life, and they experience a second death, and that is when Jesus, the victor, the one who died and came to life, the beginning and the end, will now throw death and Hades into the lake of fire, and everyone with it, with death and Hades, whose name was not written in the lake of fire. In the book of life, they go into the lake of fire. Wrestle with that. As much as Jesus knows, listen to this, it's simple but profound. Jesus knows about the crown of Smyrna in Mount Pagus, doesn't he? Why would he say crown of life? He knows about this local church's poverty, their persecution, their tribulation. Why would he point it out and say, you are rich in heaven? He knows about the synagogue and the Jews and what they're doing, yet Jesus has already been crucified, resurrected, and is at the right hand of the Father, waiting to come back again, but he knows all of it. Do you think he also knows it's true, this about the second death? Yes. He knows all of it. And so you're getting not a cartoon picture, but a real picture. They will not be hurt at all in the second death. Now, there is in the annals of history, written by Ignatius and Irenaeus and Eusebius, a compilation, a list of martyrs and their stories. One such martyr, his name is Polycarp. Polycarp was discipled by John. Polycarp becomes the bishop of Smyrna. In his old age, Caesar wants Polycarp arrested because he won't worship Caesar, he won't worship the gods, and he's leading all kinds of other people to not worship the gods. And so he's chased. This is an old man, Polycarp. He's chased, he's found. They capture him. They, according to this document, which you could pull up, called the Epistle Concerning the Martyrdom of Polycarp. It is an ancient document by eyewitnesses. It tells what they saw and heard, okay, about the martyrs and of Polycarp. And it says that the soldiers, when they arrested Polycarp, thought, is this man venerable? I mean, he's an old man. Why are we taking him? So they put him on a donkey and they take him to the stadium where the proconsul has waited. He's filled the stadium and he sets Polycarp right in front of, think of a pie wedge of a group of Christians, and the stadium, then the rest of it is filled with Romans and Jews. It tells us in the letter that this is a high Sabbath this day. There are only a couple of those a year. It's like an extra Sabbath. And why would it tell us something Jewish? Because what should the Jews not be doing on the high Sabbath? They are synagogue of Satan kind of people, right? That's why it gives us that. And so they bring him into the stadium. And the proconsul puts him in front of the Christians, this old man. And they demand that he denounced Christ. Now, you've seen stuff like this on the news recently. They denounced Christ. He denounced Christ. And so Polycarp says nothing. And then the proconsul says, if you will simply point your hand at the Christians and say, away with the atheist, you can live. Now, in that world, the atheist is the one who won't worship the Roman gods and the emperor. It's backwards to you, but that's what it is. So away with the atheists, that would be the Christians. Polycarp, this old man, facing the Christians, turns, lifts his hand, does this to everybody else in the stadium, and says, away with the atheist. Yeah, chutzpah is what we call that. Or do you get to a point where you're just so old you don't care? Some of you, you've told that to me before. I don't care. I don't care anymore. And Polycarp is there. So then they say to him, denounce Christ. He says, no. So you know what they do? They plan to burn him at the stake in the stadium. It says that the Jews rushed to get the wood. These are not Jews, real Jews, but the Jews from the synagogue of Satan that Jesus has called out on the high Sabbath. So as they get ready to light this fire, they announce, this is the teacher of Asia, the father of the Christians, and the overthrower of our gods. He who has been teaching many not to sacrifice or to worship the gods. That's what he's accused of. As they begin to light the fire, they give him one last chance, and he says this, and I quote, 86 years have I served him, and he never did me any injury. How then can I blaspheme my King and my Savior? And they light him up. He was burned at the stake. He did not die in the fire, so he was pierced with a dagger. He is the 12th on a list of those martyred from Smyrna. I cannot prove it, but based on how long he said he followed Christ and when the letter from John hit Smyrna, I believe he was in that house listening to that letter being read. And he became the bishop of Smyrna. The account ends this way. It is incredible. These guys that are writing this down, it says, they're historians. Now the blessed Polycarp suffered martyrdom on the second day of the month of Xanthicus, having just begun, the seventh day before Calends of May end. I don't have time to explain all that. And on the great Sabbath, at the 8th hour, he was taken by Herod, Philip the Trallian being high priest, and Statius Quadratus being proconsul. But he was also taken by Jesus Christ, being king forever, to whom be glory, honor, majesty, and an everlasting throne from generation to generation. So be it. Period. Now, when I hear of things like this, I often feel guilty, truthfully. This is easy. And there are three conclusions that I can draw from this letter for us that I think you have to consider. Number one is this. Every day, a Christian martyr in America is one who chooses to die to self in order to live for Christ. Before the great story of Polycarp at the end, he died to himself every day. Same with John. John disciples Polycarp. Polycarp looks a lot like John in those moments because he looks like his disciple. Who discipled John? Jesus. John looks a lot like Jesus. Polycarp looks a lot like John. Therefore, Jesus, and Polycarp look a lot alike. Right? So the scripture, it clearly says this, Mark 8:34-38. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. We die to self to live for him. We die to self, we fight sin, we live for him. Second conclusion that I would draw is this. The older generation, the oldest one that's here today, I believe in our nation you will not face persecution for the gospel. You've faced hardship early on in wars and economic disaster and the building of the church and all that. You've faced all kinds of hardship, but you lived in an America that had a Judeo-Christian ethic. Yeah, I don't think you're going to face persecution, the oldest ones here. However, the youngest ones here, I believe that they will face persecution based on my understanding of Scripture and the culture shift that is being made. And the call to you then is to not fear, to be faithful unto death, and you will receive the crown of life. And the call to us, oldest ones, the boomers, the Gen Xers, disciple the youngest generation like John discipled Polycarp. Because you have not seen what they will have to face. I don't think. It's different. It's changing rapidly. Okay. We look a lot like Rome. You look at Smyrna, that could be in America. Right? We're not so, but maybe one day. Who knows? Who knows? The last thing is this, I would say to all of us, is that we have to be willing. When Jesus calls us, we have to be willing to go places and do things, whether martyrdom and persecution is a possibility or not. Okay, so when Jesus calls us to that, we are faithful unto death. And we go. That might mean you might be scared to talk to somebody at work, but he may call you one day to plant a church in the Middle East, for all I know. To make a stand here in the United States of America for the gospel's sake, for all I know. I don't know. But when he calls us to these things, we have to be willing to lean into persecution, even if martyrdom is a possibility for the glory of Christ. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches.